a lot more references to it from 2014. And I was trying to understand, just as kind of a journalist, what on earth information war actually is. Because I always thought about propaganda as, I don't know, you have one set of people giving an opinion over here, and you have another set of people giving an opinion over there, and they have an argument with each other, and then, one side wins. And I started reading into kind of the Russian approach to information war, and it was quite eye-opening. I started looking at sort of old kind of military theory from the 90s and 2000s, and there's a real kind of push within Russian military thinking to embrace information warfare as an aspect of the future of war. And it thinks about information in a very kind of instrumentalized way. So information isn't a sort of a set of arguments or ideals. It's really just a way of sort of messing with the enemy, to divide, to delay, to slow them down, and so on and so forth. I even found a wonderful book called, it's like an encyclopedia that gets given to Russian bureaucrats and military students. Information Psychological War Operations, a short encyclopedia and reference guide. It's like a handbook for junior information warriors. It's designed for students, political technologists, state security services, and civil servants. And it talks about information like an invisible radiation. The population doesn't even feel it is being acted upon. So the state doesn't switch on its self-defense mechanisms. Tim Thomas is someone from the American military side who's looked at sort of development of Russian information war theory, and essentially it's got 2 or 3 main ingredients to it. One of them is that the future of war will go more and more away from military towards information operations. That blurs the lines between peace and war, so you can start engaging with the enemy without ever declaring war. And it's kind of a permanent state. It never really ends. So this is, without doubt, sort of a serious bit of Russian kind of military thinking. And it's, as 2016 kind of wore on, and there were all these conversations about information war, in the US suddenly, I sort of find myself at think tanks in DC where real military experts, not journalists like myself, but real military experts would have these incredibly intense fights about how to call the new Russian theory of war. Was it full spectrum warfare? Was it ambiguous warfare? Was it hybrid warfare? A lot of people like hybrid warfare, which I think basically just is a nice way of saying Russian without ever saying Russia. And then have these incredibly intense fights, full spectum warfare, and then on and on and on. And I was like, oh my God, this is these people are experts, and I don't really have a right to kind of involve myself in these conversations. But as I read further into the way kind of information war is thought about in Russia, I realized that actually it's not just about a military theory, which military experts and state security people have to think about a lot. It's almost like some sort of quasi, I use the word ideology very, very loosely here, a worldview, should we say. It's a way of explaining away the world. So in the late 2000s, you already have a guy that Ilya has written about beautifully in his book called Igor Panarin, a former KGB guy, stroke academic, who's writing books about really how the whole of modern history should be seen as information warfare. The Soviet Union fell, not because it had terrible economic, social problems, governance issues, but because of an information operation. I think it was Operation Perestroika, a 5th column of reformers put into the Kremlin by the West, as it fed up as kind of the dissidents in the country and attacked with the BBC and Radio Free Europe to bring down the Soviet Union. Now, first, these kind of, this information war as a worldview, it was contained to kind of freaks like Panarin. I think I used the word freak there academically. And then slowly, as the protests that we heard about in Russia happened in 11-12, you see mainstream government officials start taking this up, saying, no, the protests aren't because of genuine social discontent, it's an information operation by the West. Then you have the heads of RT and Россия Сегодня, who are similarly named but actually different organizations, who do propaganda, starting to talk about the world in terms of information warfare, themselves quite proudly as information warriors. It enters sort of the Russian sort of security doctrine. And it becomes kind of a way of explaining the whole world. I mean, one of the guys that I talk about in my new book, the upcoming one coming out in September, called This Is Not Propaganda, this is not a plug, is Igor Ashmanov. So Igor Ashmanov, now he's not a crusty spook. This is one of the founders of the Russian internet, certainly the way he describes himself. One of the creators, I think, of one of Russia's early search engines. This is a tech guy. This is not a sort of dribbling crazy person. This is somebody with a beautiful office in central Moscow with fruit everywhere. I mean, he looked completely normal at any tech gathering, fluent English-ish, an international guy. And I came to his office in Moscow, and I'll just read a couple of quotes because I can't remember them by heart, but it sort of captures the spirit of this. The fall of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Iraq, we've lived through many information wars, he told me. He's also told Russian lawmakers that Google, Facebook and Twitter are ideological weapons aimed at Russia, and that profit is only a secondary necessity for them. Because American Secret Service operations, says Ashmanov, such as Google, need to be economically self-sufficient. That's one of the ways the American government works. Now his big idea is information sovereignty. And there was kind of like this lovely moment in his office when I asked him, so what do you do? How do you make your money? He's like, oh yeah, I create internet filters. And I'm like, but hold on, so you're pushing for information sovereignty and a Russian firewall, and you make filters? And he kind of read my thoughts that actually he's doing this out of very cynical profit-making motives, and he quickly told me, no, I don't want to do business with the government. They're a terrible client. But there was one lovely quote that I had from him. This is sort of him. If your ideology is imported, as with liberalism, then you're always playing to foreign rules, which are always being changed by someone else. You can always be called guilty for breaking the rules of democracy. Ideology should be created inside a country, like operational systems, rockets, insulin and grain, supported and defended by information sovereignty. So his big idea was, Russia needs an ideology in order to have an excuse to start censoring foreign news and foreign websites. So it's a very interesting kind of worldview. It's very topsy-turvy. It's like information precedes essence. It's sort of the opposite of the Cold War, where you had genuine ideological competition that led to different types of confrontation. Here you have the opposite. You find, an information interest, and then you create an ideology on top of it in order to make sense of it. So it's a very topsy-turvy world, and it's, I suppose, the essence of the idea of information war as kind of worldview is there are no values in the world. There's no real big arguments to have. Everything is just instrumentalized. Yeah? You only create ideology in the sense that it has some sort of military effect. It's not a place where you can win any arguments. It's not a place where you can really aspire to anything. And so I started getting a little bit worried when I saw that in the West we were all kind of repeating this information war framing over and over and over. And I think, look, information doesn't work like weapons. Information doesn't work like bullets, Information works largely through agenda setting and framing. That's kind of like the two basic tools we have as thinking about it. And when we start describing the world through information war framings, I think several risks start to appear. I think we're already seeing some of them. Firstly, it's just very depressing. If you stop thinking about what your opponent is saying in terms of their arguments and their values and so on, you just think of it in terms of information warfare, it's a very, very cynical way of looking at the world. Also, it's very, very polarizing. You're not thinking about sort of your opponent anymore as someone you can engage with in a deliberative debate. You're simply thinking of them as smearing you or attacking you. And that's not a very sort of healthy thing for ways for democracies to think about these issues. And there might be a slight geopolitical danger as well, because I suppose what is the end game? If we all start thinking about the world in terms of information war, then the only solution, I suppose, is information peace, and that would be some sort of information sovereignty. If I were the Russians, what I would do is create these information attacks and then sue for peace. And say, well, let's all stop doing this and let's have censorship of some sort. So you create the framework where censorship might become normalized. So I just want to very quickly go through some of the responses that I've seen to actually dealing with this challenge. Because it's kind of a paradox. You can't ignore what the Russians are doing. You can't ignore their information influence operations. You can't just, like Jared Kushner said the other day, it's a couple of Facebook ads. There's deeper troubles than that. In 2008 in Estonia, we kind of saw how a mixture of cyber attacks, incited riots, and propaganda basically shut down Estonia for several days. Do you all know the story, I assume? You studied the region. Okay. So, Russian information operations are not to be taken lightly. On the other hand, if we start framing the whole debate in exactly the way they want, we've lost as well. So I'm going to give 2 or 3 examples of how I've seen different people deal with it. So one way to deal with this is not to answer in the information space at all. I mean, it could be a very big mistake to think that the way to answer information operations is through other types of information operations. So in one very large country in the middle of Europe, is this Chatham House, or is it recorded?
Yeah, it's recorded.
It's recorded, okay, a very large country in the middle of Europe, end of land, yeah? So basically, before the last elections, 2017, which we did some research on, somebody, most probably the Russians, had kind of hacked the Bundestag and had laid out a bunch of websites to start leaking the material, a lot like the DNC leaks. And this was told to me completely off the record, so I don't know, I'm probably like breaking some trust here, but it never happened. The Russians never went through with it. And I asked sort of the German Kanzleramt, what happened? Why did they not do it? It's like, well, we had a quiet word with them. We kind of said that there would be a cost. They didn't tell me what the cost would be. I assumed the cost wasn't informational. I assumed the cost would have been economic. We won't open that factory the Mercedes factory in Bryansk or something. Overall, I expect that the most potent responses to Russian information influence operations won't be in the information space. Yeah? Democracies are always kind of rubbish in that space, for many reasons. Because of the need to protect freedom of speech, because of less of a habit of using state mechanisms for disinformation in the West anyway. So it's about finding the vulnerabilities that the Kremlin does have and targeting those. And they have many. Sort of Putin's Russia is a classic dilemma situation. They need sort of the narrative of a confrontation with the West in order to create a bit of national solidity around the leader. At the same time, they're economically and in so many other ways completely dependent on the West. We have brought in some sanctions against Russia, but they've been very, very unthought through, and certainly what we haven't thought through in any detail is what would be the proportionate response in terms of sanctions to information operations. But that can be one way to go. Another way, which is a much more kind of information-based way, and which I've seen kind of most effectively actually used on the ground in Ukraine, where these questions are existential. They're not just little games like they are in a lot of Europe, and partly here, these are existential issues. So, I think Olga even mentioned there was a horrific fire in Odessa during kind of the high point of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It was a fire where, due to a very complex set of messy events, 40 or so pro-Russians died, pro-Russian demonstrators died, and immediately there was this kind of massive information effort on the part of the Kremlin to incite more civil strife in Ukraine. The message seemed to be, it was a very messy situation, but the message seemed to be that, Putin, our city is in a mess, come and rescue us, come and occupy us and bring peace. That seemed to be the overall framing. So a very, very dangerous situation. Since then we've had a lot of kind of like audio leaks of sort of essentially gangsters in Odessa getting instructions from their Russian caretakers to incite violence there. And so I talked to sort of the head of the local information department, a woman called Zoya Kazanji, who was sort of running it at the time. And I asked, what was your information strategy during this period? And largely it was to move away from any talk of information war. And what they actually did was they kind of reframed the whole debate. Because basically what the Russian argument was that Putin would come in and bring peace. And so Zoya and her team put posters everywhere, which she explained to me, of what was happening in the Donbass, so war. And the idea was that if Putin comes, you won't get peace, you'll get war. So she moved away as far as possible from any kind of conversations about information confrontation, ethnic confrontation between Russians and Ukrainians in the city, and tried to completely change the debate, which, is a perfectly sensible PR sort of approach to an information problem. And then the last response that I want to mention is a regulatory response, which I think is probably the one that we're going to have to start to move to. And that reframes the question of information war away from a Russia problem to being a problem of how we clean up the internet generally, and how we start to introduce regulation into it? I know that's a very fraught question in America due to sort of First Amendment issues. In Europe, some countries have kind of charged ahead with this and have done so in a very short-termist way, essentially trying to take down all kinds of what they think is illegal or harmful content from online. That's what the Germans have done. It's probably an unworkable solution. If we think about, trying to regulate every piece of content on the internet, that's going to be very, very hard. There's a new approach that the British are putting forward. I'm very much keeping in mind, that Russia is one of the reasons they started thinking about this, is trying to package the problem in terms of harms. Yeah? What is the harms of certain types of campaigns or activity on the internet? And then having a relationship with the platforms where they have to put systems in place which mitigate those harms. So something that gets you a little bit away from the question of harmful content to harmful types of behavior. So for example, are we okay as a society with what the sort of stuff that Josh was talking about, coordinated inauthentic behavior on the internet, should we even have that? If the algorithms are being played by Russian bots, what kind of relationship can we have with the company, with the tech companies, so that we have a little bit of input into the way those algorithms are created and protected? So that's kind of, I think, the way the debate is going to go, which is also fraught with difficulties. But it does give you something, because it gets you away from a non-stop over-focus sometimes on Russia, and into a debate where we can start talking about transparency, where we can start talking about what is the difference between legitimate influence and illegitimate manipulation online. I'm looking above you because I was given 20 minutes, I've hit 20 minutes. So I'm just going to stop there. Pause.
Thank you very much, Peter. For those we'll collect, as we have already started, questions for our speakers at the end of the panel. At this point in time, I would like to ask Ilya Yablokov from the University of Leeds to go ahead with his presentation.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate that you invited me to speak about RT. So, my name is Ilya Yablokov, I'm from the University of Leeds, and this is the brand new project I'm working on. It's about the channel, which all of you might know, Russia Today, RT, and the way how this channel engages with conspiracy theories. So, first of all, a few words on definitions. So, we know about conspiracies, they exist. It's part of our life, politics, intelligence, service work, day-to-day life, for example, on campus at the university. So we all are familiar with that, right? But what's the difference between conspiracy and conspiracy theories? Conspiracy theory is a specific way of perceiving reality, perceiving the world. So it's a specific interpretation that kind of means that there is a secret law, there is a secret agreement of two or more people or creatures, if we speak, for example, about lizard people. And so this plot normally makes people's life worse. So there is a lot of discussion about how to perceive conspiracy theories. A lot of people say that it's a kind of product of paranoid minds. However, latest research in conspiracy theories says that actually conspiracy theories could be a healthy method to protect democracy and to show that there is something wrong in the society that should be fixed. And conspiracy theories are showing us the way of how and what should be fixed. So I'm based, my project and my methodology is based on the work by Mark Fenster, my colleague from the University of Florida, who argued that conspiracy theories are the populist theory of power. So they help to redistribute legitimacy between various social actors, no matter who they are, left-wing, right-wing, what's their status, what's their place in the society. So conspiracy theories just help to these social actors to divide the social between the people, kind of the majority, and the other, which is considered as a major threat. So in that sense, this populist reading of conspiracy theories helps us understand why, in the current reality, there's so many conspiracy theories, and that they are actually a normal way to react to certain conditions. So when I looked at the conspiracy theories in post-Soviet Russia, I used this methodology of dividing society between the people and the other and tried to figure out what are the most popular conspiracy theories. And these are the conspiracy about the West. So traditionally in Russia for ages, the West, perceived as a single undifferentiated entity, was perceived either as good stuff, kind of as a good entity, good model to emulate, or the bad thing, something to kind of run from, something to avoid. So what we see in the post-Soviet Russia is that conspiracy theories about the West basically help to mobilize the people in support of various political actions, mostly of the Kremlin, and also conspiracy theories help to unite the nation and help to mobilize, kind of help to create, tactically create, on the short-term basis, kind of the majority of people in support of authorities. And certainly, kind of the major enemy, the other in these conspiracy theories, is the West, or to be precise, the United States and the United Kingdom. So when I looked at conspiracy theories within Russia, I kind of understood that conspiracy theories about the West within Russia have been kind of transported to the Russian foreign policies. And thanks to this guy on the picture, Vladislav Surkov, who was basically one of the ideologues of this concept of conspiracy theories against Russia in the 2000s, he helped to explain that actually conspiracy theories are not about they are not the kind of the peace and of marginal paranoid minds. Our Russians' competition with the West is just competition. It's business. It's not the war normally. So it's not the information war. It's just the competition. While information war might be part of what we might do. And so the US, according to this ideology, and according to the agenda of RT that was created in the mid-2000s, is actually the threat to the global peace. And another step that was made by the Kremlin in the 2000s is to find a niche for the Russian propaganda against the West and explain why Russia must represent the interest of all other parties, of all other countries and social actors around the world who also should oppose the West, or in other words, the United States and the United Kingdom and other entities. At the same time, Vladimir Putin was kind of pushed and created, the image was created of Vladimir Putin as a certain leader of the global opposition. The person who should stand against the West, against the United States, and basically protect those who need this protection. And that's where I come to RT. So RT that was created in 2005 as a typical soft power tool, basically after the Russian-Georgian war in 2008, absolutely changed the agenda. Russia Today, that launched its American broadcasting in 2010, launched it with that feature, 9/11 questions to the American government about 9/11. It's a very peculiar way to engage in the domestic issues. So in that sense, I argue that Russia Today is, and the conspiracy theories as a part of Russia Today agenda, is basically one of the diplomatic tools, first to undermine the policies of the United States government, and also to spread this criticism to various social, political, economic issues that take place, within the US, domestically, and also to other international audience that are able to consume this information in English and in other languages. So to illustrate that, I'm focusing on two Russia Today programs. One that was launched in 2013, which was called the Truthseekers, and was presented by the British RT's London correspondent Daniel Bushell, and that was shut down in 2015 because it was too controversial. And the second program, which basically then continues the same line as the Truthseeker, the world according to Jesse Ventura, a very kind of popular, strange guy, ex-marine, ex-governor, ex-wrestler, TV presenter, whatever you know. So he is he's quite a popular guy amongst certain groups in the United States. So let's have a look how RT actually engages with conspiracy theories. So first of all, as the Truthseeker, the episode 0 of the Truthseeker actually deals again with the 9/11 conspiracy theories. The reason is that, according to various research, 9/11 conspiracy theories are one of the central elements of the current American conspiracy culture. This is the event which helped to unite various communities within the United States who are critical of the government, critical of how the government dealt with this terrorist attack and with the investigation. So RT, in this very first episode, puts together various interpretations of the failures that the government made after 9/11, and they basically intervene with various kind of bits and bobs of evidence that the government should not be trusted. So they kind of bring together this movement of engineers and architects who are looking for the truth about 9/11. So they kind of, the presenter and the guest also kind of emphasize kind of how important is the skepticism of the official line. And here, so basically this idea of the truth and the trust is very important. So what the RT does, in fact, RT basically creates the alternative regime of truth, if we quote Foucault. So basically, in this regime, people should not trust the government. There is an alternative reality that helps to explain everything that the government does through that lens of the government cover-ups and false flag operations. And so in this reality, no one possesses the truth. So if you look at the RT's agenda, which is so well kind of formulated on that slide, you're going to see that, well, there might be Russia's invasion. Some argue about that. However, what we know for sure is that the government was carrying so many false flag operations, was involved in so many government cover-up operations. So how we can actually, how can we trust that? So what RT does in the next step, at the end of the program, they cherry-pick specific experts who do not criticize the official line. They actually support, they argue for the point of view created by Daniel Bushell. And also, they bring up the voice of the experts to create these conspiracy theories, but also they bring up the voice of the common folk that is also critical of the government. So they kind of put all these different bits of evidence just to basically promote three main narratives. And these main narratives could be found more or less in all the programs. So the first narrative is that the corrupt government consists of the hoax, and they're going to do everything to destroy the world and make as much money they can. Then they will be helped by big business, corporation, Wall Street, that controls politicians to protect their power. And here they are referring constantly to the 2008 economic crisis. That is the major milestone, again, just like 9/11, in the global conspiracy culture. And the third element that is repeated again and again is hypocritical mainstream media that help to spread this information about government cover-up. So let's have a look in details at these narratives. So the first narrative that is constantly repeated in the Truthseeker is that the United States is the terrorist state that bombs everyone in the world, and it's cruel as hell. And they refer to various American politicians like Hillary Clinton, who sat behind the, off the record about the Libyan president. We came, we saw he died. So kind of they use that reference to show that, look how cruel American politicians are. Then there's always this reference to the official, semi-official, or fake documents about kind of a certain imperialist ambitions of the United States government. And that the United States government, for instance, works hand in hand with Hollywood to provide films and various other footage as an evidence for invasion into other foreign countries. And they, for example, refer to the Iran affair and the possible invasion of the United States in Iran in 2013. Also, to make it more kind of close to the hearts of ordinary Americans, of course, the presenters refer to the taxpayers' money. So taxpayers' money basically help the United States government to wage all these wars around the world at the expense of ordinary Americans. And at the same time, ordinary Americans are being threatened by the same government. And here we see quite an interesting engagement with the far-right conspiracy theories. So, for example, in the 1990s, among American far-right conspiracy theories, there was a popular idea of the black helicopters. Now, in 2010s, this idea evolved in the drones that are looking for Americans and destroy, kind of kill Americans in their backyards. That's what the presenters and their guests are normally arguing. Then, at the same time, with the far-right conspiracy theories, RT is very carefully kind of using left-wing conspiracy theories, for example, addressing the audiences who support Bernie Sanders, and basically experts and presenters normally call the big business and the government as faceless and ruthless bankers who will do their best to get the money out of other regions, turn the whole world into the big colony, and basically strip them of their resources. So here comes up a very weird idea of the New World Order that is also kind of popular amongst the far right and the far left, but again, presenters and guests of the Truthseeker normally refer to a variety of conspiracy theories related to the New World Order conspiracy theories, just to show that, well, actually, what we're talking here on RT is very relevant to everyone. It's relevant for the people to know. And who is hiding this information, apart from the big business and the crooked government? Certainly the crooked press. And the mainstream media are working hand in hand again with the government, with the oligarchs, and with the CIA, just to make sure that ordinary Americans never know the truth. However, it's a Russian channel. Where is Russia here? And surprisingly, Russia does not appear on RT. For one simple reason. If you look at, for example, the reports about Putin or Russian domestic politics, my colleagues from Manchester calculated it's around 6% of the time devoted to Russia, actually. So when something important, really big thing happens in Russia, then RT engages in the coverage of this event. So for example, in 2013, a famous Boston bombing at the marathon, at that moment, the Truthseeker really engaged in the coverage of the Boston Marathon, but what they did, they basically said that it was another false flag operation by the US government with the reason to invade Chechnya. This is quite weird, because Chechnya is part of Russia, and the United States would never invade Russia, right? But nobody really cares, right? So, in 2015, the program, The Truthseeker, was closed because they engaged very actively and emotionally into the coverage of the Ukraine crisis. And so they crossed a few lines, red lines, and the program was completely shut down, removed from the official website. Now it could be found on YouTube and on torrents. So it was replaced by another program in 2017 by Jesse Ventura, and it was launched exactly during the so-called this Russiagate affair. And Jesse Ventura, when he presented his program, he basically started with, why are we so focused on Russia? Why do we think that Russia invaded American democracy, invaded America during the elections? They didn't, because the United States did that so many times in the history of the 20th century, so we shouldn't really talk about Russia. Russia is the ultimate boogeyman for the crooked American press and the corrupt American government. And what, if you look at all these episodes, I don't recommend, this is quite a strange experience. So if you watch all these episodes, you realize that it's basically the same topics repeated again and again and again. Media corrupt, government is kind of trying to destroy their own people by, for example, polluting the waters and trying to cover up its crimes, such as MLK, Martin Luther King assassination. And, for example, if we talk about conspiracy theories, what is the first conspiracy theory that comes to mind? Certainly the aliens, alien invasion, and the X-Files, kind of a crucial series that basically put conspiracy theories in the mainstream of culture. But Jesse Ventura engages with this traditional culture of conspiracy theories by using the reference to that famous extraterrestrial expert who argued that he actually briefed US presidents on the existence of some alien technologies possessed by the US military. But even the president never knew about it before he briefed him. So, but the point was that the government is dangerous because it helps the oil companies, the gas companies to run their business, because if the alien technologies would be spread among the Americans, ordinary Americans and the people of the world wouldn't suffer from oil spills, from this climate change. So it's all because of the big business and government. And in the same way, when Russia is in the headlines, Russia is described as the boogeyman and as a normal state whose basically policies are normal, and it's just about competition. So just to conclude, I think that RT and studying the way how RT engages with conspiracy theories is a great way, and it's a portal to understand how conspiracy theories develop in our societies in general, and also to look at conspiracy theories not as the narrative of one particular nation state, because in the 21st century with this new media ecology, it's pointless to talk about conspiracy theories as the product of nation-state culture. The example of RT shows us that conspiracy theories can be produced in one country, spread and kind of transmitted to another country, or some of the conspiracy theories could be relevant internationally. So I think it's kind of, it opens the floor for extremely interesting questions, and some of these questions could be asked within the paradigm of these information wars. Thank you.
Again, probably those questions that you raised about will be asked in the Q&A session. And I'll use the opportunity to ask Aliaksandr Herasimenka from the University of Westminster for his presentation. Thank you. Where's yours?
Okay, now it's okay.
Conspiracy.
Yeah, conspiracy. This is not mine, yeah? They look absolutely similar. Amazing. All right, hi. My name is Aliaksandr Herasimenka. I'm from University of Westminster. And, okay, I gonna tell two short stories today. One story is from Russia, and another one is from Belarus. Okay, and yeah. And they're all about using messaging platforms. All right, so the first story, the one that comes from Russia, is about a presidential campaign of one of the most prominent opposition leaders in Russia, Alexei Navalny. I believe most of you heard of it. We already heard a few references to him today as well. And the second story is from Belarus, but it's also related to Russia, because it's about quite weird misinformation campaign that targeted Belarusian authorities in 2018. And many people suggested that it was related to Russia and somehow came from Russia. All right. And what unites those stories is first of all, the prominence of the use of digital platforms in both cases to disseminate political information or disinformation. And how this information was disseminated. One of the key platforms used to disseminate this information was a messaging platform. Now, perhaps most of you are users of all kinds of messaging platforms, and one of the most popular is WhatsApp. And you may observe how messaging platforms change in political landscape. For instance, this is the screenshot from the BuzzFeed publication that discussed this never-ending saga of Brexit in the United Kingdom. And it discussed some leaks that came from Tory party, ruling party in UK, that discussed the approaches to Brexit last year. And this is an example how journalists increasingly use digital platforms to discuss, to get information and discuss political life. They get leaks from conversations of politicians. So politicians in small groups and larger groups discuss things. In that case, they were members of parliament. They discussed politics, and those stories they discussed, they've been leaked. And they went to media, and journalists were very happy to share these stories. People also use messaging platforms to organize, to coordinate themselves. For instance, ERG group within Tory party is essentially a WhatsApp group. Now, my stories are not about WhatsApp. They're about something else that is called Telegram. Telegram is a messaging platform, and I would very much love to know how many of you ever heard of Telegram before. Oh, wow. Everyone, almost everyone, very well. Anyone used it before? Few people, but yeah, about half, very well. So most of you know what is it. It looks like WhatsApp. Plus, there is another feature that makes it more similar to YouTube, maybe, to social media. This is something called channel. So essentially every user of Telegram can establish a channel, but in contrast to YouTube, you don't broadcast videos normally on Telegram, but you broadcast texts. So everyone can establish those channels with texts, and people read them. They could be quite long texts. Interestingly, you cannot really like normally those texts on channels. You cannot even comment on them normally. The only thing you can do is text on channels. You can share them. For some reason, there are many reasons maybe for this, Telegram became quite prominent in predominantly Russian-speaking countries as a place where people come together and discuss political information, political life. It's the case of Russia, it's the case of Belarus, it's the case of Iran, for instance. At least until recently. Now, so the first story is about how Navalny campaign used Telegram. And this was a story from his presidential campaign attempt to be registered as a candidate during last year presidential elections in Russia, which was, of course, not very successful for him in terms of registration. He wasn't registered. However, the campaign was associated with several waves of quite large anti-corruption and pro-democracy protests across Russia, and it involved many localities, which is unusual for Russia, where normally political life is concentrated in a few large cities, right? At that time it was up to 100 different locations where those waves of protest associated with his campaign were happening. And of course, one of the main issues, main difficulties for political activists in non-democracies in authoritarian states like Belarus or Russia is to how to reach larger audience, right? How to disseminate information when mainstream media, like TV, is tightly controlled by the state. So state controls TV, no access to TV. Those people need to talk to wider audience that do not check. Maybe they even, well, they use social media, right? And on social media, people maybe not subscribe to any political channels, political pages, political groups. So how to access them? This campaign, one of the main ways it used to get access to wider audience was something I call three-step scheme of information dissemination with Telegram. So the first step was using campaign accounts. That's what many politicians do in many countries. You had to create campaign accounts, they use it to share all kind of stories, information, and so on. The second step is to send these links to these publications on campaign accounts to Telegram. And the campaign of Navalny created hundreds of Telegram channels across Russia. There were many hundreds, and they could unite just few pro-democracy activists in small localities somewhere in Siberia. It could be huge groups of thousands of users in Moscow. Activists, co-activists of the Navalny campaign shared links to those Telegram channels and asked their followers to disseminate those links using their private profiles. So people who shared these stories, they shared them through private profiles following Telegram links being shared by the co-activists. So the users, ordinary users, their friends, their neighbors, maybe 20, 50, 100 of them, could see this political information in private profile. And it appeared one of the quite successful way in terms of accessing larger audiences. Once campaign asks, links disseminated quite quickly across profiles of ordinary users. And it reached some significant audience. It was one of the many ways, of course, to access large audience. Okay, the second story. And the second story is about Belarus. And this is about those weird titles that appeared in international media few months ago, starting July 2018. Titles like Ex-Chief of NATO sees annexation, war in Belarus as probable scenario. A brotherly takeover. Could Russia annex Belarus? Or in the face, the Belarusian president won't go down without a fight. Nonsense, right? You might ask, what is that at all? Well, first of all, what is Belarus? There are almost no news in international media ever about Belarus. No one discusses it, and many people suggest that, okay, it's because nothing is happening in Belarus. They have the same president for 25 years. He's not planning to step down. Seems like, yeah, he's quite healthy and so on. What the hell is that? That was my question. So the second story, and of course you would expect this kind of rhetoric on the other hand, if you remember that recently aggressiveness becomes increasingly prominent in the Russian political discourse, that many people, ordinary citizens, say that the greatness of the state of Russia, it relates to its territorial reach. At the same time, Belarus is a neighbor of Russia, and very, some people say close allied, but at the same time, they have a long history of all kinds of confrontations. And those confrontations are very cyclical. So they're happening, they're starting somewhere from some kind of attacks, some kind of information campaign in Russian media, and then Lukashenko makes some reforms, some step towards Russia, and then this campaign just disappears as it started. But these days, it's a bit different story. Those days, there were many campaigns like that in Russian TV, on the Russian TV mostly, that targeted Belarusian government. But these days, it's not TV anymore. It's mostly online media. And this is the network of new, quite recently appeared on the stage of local, mostly local, especially this segment, local online media that started appearing across Belarusian media landscape. So local media, new local media started developing in 2018. And if you look at the connections between them, specifically what kind of information they've been sharing between each other, you find that those local media, they often share the same kind of content between themselves. And apparently they're connected to three organizations with roots in Russia. One of them, called CREEES IMO, which is about election observations across CIS countries, which is kind of gong organization controlled by Moscow officials. Second organization that has connections to all of those, most of those new media that target Belarus, local Belarus stories, is called Soyuz, very recently established, and the third one is apparently Russian embassy in Belarus. They are online news websites, but they're not, so far at least, that popular in Belarus according to number of views they get. Audience, they share not very large audience, but other kind of media are important in Belarus, and they're independent media. Independent media, what I mean by independent is those media that are not controlled by any state. So not controlled by Russia, not controlled by Belarusian state, not controlled by Polish state, independent media, in that way. So they're commercial, but independent from states, more or less. And I looked at them, and I looked for political stories since July 2018, since those strange titles started appearing in international media. What they say about Lukashenko and politics, Lukashenko president of Belarus, and whether they anyhow mention Telegram in their articles. So I was looking for articles in independent, most popular, most visited independent Belarusian media that are using Telegram as a source of information. And I was specifically interested in those articles that referenced some bit of information and had Telegram as a source of it, and no other sources for that bit of information provided, and those Telegram channels were anonymous, so we didn't know who the authors of those channels were. You remember, channels are like sort of YouTube channels as well, but no video, text only. That's how those posts on Telegram look like. And that's the topics discussed. I found about 30 articles in independent media that use Telegram as a source, and that's what kind of information they discussed. Russia plans to annex Belarus. Lukashenko loses his power. Lukashenko had a stroke and is unable to rule. Belarus increases military cooperation with the US. Moscow does not control Belarus branch of Russian Orthodox Church, and so on and so forth. We can perhaps call most of those stories misinformation, because, well, Lukashenko didn't have any stroke, we know it. That's that time when those news appeared. We don't know really whether Russia plans any annexation of Belarus or not. But okay, the rest of those titles are just fakes. And well, interesting. But where they come from? What kind of channels share those stories? Apparently, no surprise. The largest channel that's been referenced by independent media called Nezigar. And this is quite popular, maybe most popular political Telegram channel in Russia. And if you look at the network, how those other channels, so I traced back origins of those stories that independent media share, popular, trusted, journalist-led media, visited by millions of Belarusians every day. They led to 3 networks of Telegram channels. So networks here are created by channels that share information between each other, specifically those stories I'm looking at. One of them is focused on Nezigar, which is mostly about Russian politics. The second network is focused on Telegram channel called Bulba of Thrones, or Potatoes of Thrones, or something like that. It could be translated from Belarusian, and it's only Belarusian stories. And the third network connects both those two. So they're not connected directly, but they're connected through the third network that is dominated by channels like Kremlovsky Bezbashenik, or Dvoynoye Dno, or Master Pera. So who are those people behind those channels? They're anonymous. But recent investigation by trusted Russian journalists show that most important channels within that network are controlled by someone called Alexei Gromov. And he is called by journalists one of the heads of the Siloviki branch within the administration of President of Russia, or sort of conservative circle within administration of Russian president. As well as he was also called as the head of the propaganda department. Okay. All right. So we know maybe who is the guy behind these networks. But again, this is not, if you share information on Telegram, you don't get that high reach, yes? You get maybe 40,000 views per story, and that's it. This is a very limited reach. What those people, I think, wanted, they wanted larger reach, higher reach, and they used journalists. So how Telegram emerged as an important information channel in Russia? It emerged in the vacuum of political information, in the growing vacuum of information about politics. And we know that journalists need some links, they need something to discuss. And perhaps the reason they joined those misinformation campaigns was about, the reason was that because they had restricted access to any kind of political information. So you remember I told you two stories. One was about Navalny campaign, how they used Telegram, and the second story was about how perhaps some people in Kremlin, maybe one tower, it's the same criminology, one tower of Kremlin used Telegram. And you see that there are some similarities. And the similarity is those people behind those campaigns of misinformation or dissemination of information, they realized that they cannot reach wider audience using only Telegram. They needed something else. And in the first case, they used accounts of private individuals, supporters, ordinary users of social media beyond Telegram, VK, OK, Facebook, so on and so forth. In the second case, they used journalists. Journalists helped disseminate information. And what also united both cases is that Telegram was turned into sort of depository of this misinformation or political information. Just links or short text stored on Telegram somewhere could be accessed anytime by any kind of networks to disseminate it fully. So again, just to remind you, first, both types of information emerge from a handful of sources. Then it distributed across larger networks on Telegram. Then those networks push those information beyond Telegram to reach wider audience. And journalists, unfortunately, can help in this. And what it all shows is that Telegram is becoming, or maybe already became, a key element in the cycle of distribution of political information and disinformation in Russia and Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pretty nice. We can keep it, certainly, because we're going to go into Q&A session, and of course, now that we had talking about narratives, pushing disinformation, conspiracy theories, and content, which has been used as repositories, channels such as Telegram and so on. I would ask the participants of this panel just please come forward, and then we'll start forward with the Q&A session. Please. Thank you. Peter. I'm sorry, but yeah, the microphones are for the session, so that's why. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's the time to ask. So, please, the first one.
Very, very interesting talks. I have a question. I have several questions, I suppose, but the one that I wanted to ask was for Ilya Yablokov. So I'm probably one of the few people that has not ever watched RT. So I can't really say much about it, but I'm sort of interested, or I was interested as you were talking about Truthseeker and the other one with Jesse Ventura. To what extent are those sort of kind of outliers in their programming? I mean, because it seems like it's dealing with fairly marginal phenomena. I mean, Jesse Ventura, I think, was doing some sort of a conspiracy show before this in the States. At least I heard about it, I think, on Alex Jones. And I'm wondering, to what extent does RT, I mean, is that representative of their programming in general, or is it something like the defunct Al Jazeera America? Which actually, I mean, if it's something like Al Jazeera America, frankly, there were a lot of stories that were covered on Al Jazeera America that really didn't find, that weren't properly covered or covered seriously enough, I think, in a lot of American media. So I was wondering, I mean, what's their, how do they sell this, how do they sell themselves? Who watches it and why? I mean, other than this, what would seem to be like a fringe element.
Thank you very much.
Are we answering
Yeah,
straight
no,
away?
go ahead.
Go ahead, it's a conversation.
You're right. Thank you. How they sell these stories, and the agenda is quite clear. So everything that involves a certain criticism of the US government, the UK government, something that will kind of ring the bell within within this paradigm created in the Kremlin against the West. To what extent these stories are marginal? Some of the stories are marginal, but sometimes they have kind of good reasons to engage, let's say, in the coverage of the Olympic Games, right? Which is a good kind of a big event, the media event, which is worth covering. It involves Russia, but it also involves criticism of the US. So one of the episodes of the Truthseekers, as far as I remember, was broadcast for the first time in the middle of the closing ceremony of the Olympic Games in Sochi, right? And as we remember, one of the major kind of trends, topics to cover the Russian, the Sochi Olympic Games was that Russia just promoted this anti-LGBT legislation. So there was a lot of coverage, for example, on the BBC World News about Russia as being an anti-gay country. So what the Truthseeker did, they used that criticism of Russia right in the middle of the closing ceremony, and they showed a 10-minute, very aggressive program about how gays are suffering in the US. How many murders of gays are registered by the police every year, and they compared these numbers with Russia. And they said, look, again, this crooked media of the US are criticizing Russia, but it's groundless, because they essentially don't want to see what is going on in the US itself. So that's kind of one of the ways of engaging, for example, using the Russian issue and kind of a US issue and putting it all together. Jesse is also, well, his topics, I wouldn't say are quite mainstream. So, for example, he devotes one program to the space, some obscure space program, kind of launched by the United States, by some private company in the United States. And he says, look at this successful businessman who's running this space program, and now look at the government, which basically uses public funds to finance the Star Wars against Russia or against other countries that the United States considers as the enemy, right? So whatever is the issue, no matter how marginal, minor, unimportant it is, eventually it all kind of leads and boils down to one very kind of obvious point. We should not trust the governments, right? But when they run out of kind of big topics, they certainly pick up something minor and basically brag about it. So Jesse Ventura is the guy who, I don't think that he really prepares for his shows. So they have one co-presenter, a lady, who basically prepares all the PowerPoints, all the slides, and she basically passes the ball to Jesse Ventura. So, Mr. Governor, what do you think about that? And basically Jesse, like for 3, 4, 5 minutes, he lambasts, criticizes the government, and then he basically says, so what do you think about that? And she kind of intervenes again, shows a couple of slides, shows how crooked the US government is, how the public funds are spent, and again Jesse Ventura says, oh, instead of fixing Medicare, fixing, I don't know, polluted water somewhere in Minnesota, the government spent this money on, criticizing, on bombing Iraq, for example. So, things like that.
I mean, it's just interesting because, like, one of the conspiracy shows that I remember, now that I'm sort of recalling this, was about it was basically an explanation of the Denver airport conspiracy. So I was just thinking, is he basically recycling the material from whatever this earlier show was, the name of which I don't remember anymore, or have they sort of basically rebooted and reformatted it for an RT audience, which is going to expect something different? It seems like they obviously have.
I think that partially he recycles whatever he had in the previous program, but I think the reason why Jesse Ventura is on the channel, because he's kind of a popular guy, at least among certain audiences. So I think taking him, bringing him on RT, helped RT to bring some of those audiences from his previous program on RT. But at the same time, if he says, hey, some people call me a conspiracy theorist, but I'm just telling you the truth. They just don't like hearing the truth. That's why they try to degrade kind of my status as a critic, as a presenter, as the author, as a journalist, to the status of conspiracy theorist. So in that sense, I think our problem as kind of academics or practitioners is that we treat conspiracy theories negatively. That is kind of the product of paranoid minds, which is wrong, because it essentially helps people like Jesse Ventura refer to the real existing conspiracies or government cover-up operation and say, hey, this is wrong what you do, and then to create this counter-narrative, which is really helpful in this information wars and spreading all various rumors.
Yes, sir.
So, thanks, Ed. That was really super interesting presentations. I want to ask a couple questions about Telegram. One is a very technical question. When the Navalny campaign, we've started to look into WhatsApp and how WhatsApp is being used by election campaigns. Was the Navalny campaign, are there websites that the Navalny campaign would set up that would say, hey, look, here's 100 different Telegram channels you could choose to follow? Like, are there ways, is there an ecosystem that has emerged around listing links of Telegram channels to follow? Because what we found in India and Brazil, we're starting to see these like third-party entities who are taking links to WhatsApp groups, making web pages, which is just like, here's a whole bunch of WhatsApp groups you could join, and then they're monetizing that by like running ads on those pages. So I'm just curious whether anything similar is happening around Telegram. The second thing is I'm really intrigued by this idea of Telegram becoming a repository for information and for misinformation. And what I'm curious about, so my understanding of Telegram was that, like you said, that you could sign up to follow these particular channels and you can get these things, but I hadn't thought of it as like a repository for information before. So the repository aspect of it has to be that you're getting links to particular places. It's like, click on this link and you can find this piece of information. Why is that as a why do you think that's emerging as a repository? Like, what's the advantage of having Telegram, which you have to have signed up ahead of time to get this broadcast of this channel, serve as a repository, as opposed to a Contacte page or a Facebook public page, or something that's already public-facing and is likely to attract more attention from people and is on platforms with more people. Now, maybe it's just a Telegram super popular, but my sense is that's not the point you were making here, that it's not that, like, the value of the Telegram channel is that we all might sign up to follow it because we're all on Telegram. You're saying the value is as a repository where I can put links in blog posts or newspaper stories or all sorts of other things, or I can just chat out, message it to people and say, hey, click on this Telegram link. So what is it about Telegram that why wouldn't I just do that on the Contacte or do it on Facebook or something like that? What's peculiar about Telegram that makes it attractive in this regard?
All right, thank you. Great questions. Well, for the first question, whether there was any website that stores all the links to those ecosystem of Telegram channels that Navalny campaign created. So they indeed created an ecosystem of Telegram channels. I had a slide in the other presentation that showed this ecosystem. It was quite hierarchically based, so you have local channels that united into regional channels. For instance, there could be 5 channels and groups, 2 different types. Yeah, that's important also to understand different. Groups is like WhatsApp thing, yeah, while channel is just broadcasting. In Chelyabinsk there will be 5 groups or channels. Then you have something like Chelyabinsk Oblast, channel and group, 2 things. Then you have federal level, and then you have even higher level for only small restricted city. However, the links to those channels were normally not in the public domain. How would people join those channels and groups? Channels, since they are normally more or less open to public, yes, they could be in the public domain, for instance, on VK pages or on the local pages of the campaign, because campaign had only essentially one national website, which
But
is
is
Navalny.
that like a thing that people would be like, oh, I've got a Telegram account, I want to find a bunch of cool people to
Normally-
follow, I'm going to Google cool
Okay.
people to follow, cool channels on Telegram, and there'd be like lists of them.
That's what I did, but I think it's not what most people are doing searching now on Telegram. I don't think it's not easy. I think most of them get into those channels when they show interest in the campaign in one or another way. For instance, most of people who were coming to the office to to leave a signature for Navalny, for him to be to register as a candidate, they had to have several 100,000 signatures. I think 200,000. But 200,000 people visited offices, and all of them will ask whether you have Telegram or not very often. It's one of the way. And since I was doing a bit of photography, I was observing how it happening. People was asked, "Do you have Telegram?" Say, "No." "Okay, install Telegram, then join the group." Very often it happened again. And you have this teams of people now across towns. Or, well, through friends maybe, but it wasn't really public, no. It's not public, to my knowledge. Second, what is the value of Telegram as a repository? I would say that features or affordances of Telegram is something that been valued by those activists. So one of the key affordances of Telegram, in contrast to other social media, if we define Telegram as social media, and because of this channel option, I would define it as social media. Normally, social media do not have default push notification of every single post in your timeline, right? When every single friend on your Facebook profile posts something, you don't get automatic notifications about it, right? On Telegram, by default, when you subscribe to any channel or group, you got automatic notifications. You can switch it off, but many people don't. And they got those dozens or maybe hundreds push-up notifications. It's one of the ways to disseminate information very quickly, especially during protests. That's how protests been coordinated by this campaign. They used Telegram bots, and bots in different meaning, in kind of good bots, programmed and openly programmed by the campaign. It's one of the advantages. So, affordances. Second, what campaigners, especially those people in Navalny campaign, what they were worried about is possible censorship. Their main platform, main public platform was VK, Contact, which is most popular social media platform in Russia, right? And some of them were afraid that they might lose control of those VK pages. So in environments, in authoritarian environments like Russian, where censorship is a common thing, activists might try to protect themselves and store materials somewhere else in case their public materials been censored, been removed, been somehow banned or protected. For instance, VK is known for this. VK is also known for many criminal cases in relation to users of Russia who share political information. So it's easier and perhaps safer to save links and materials on Telegram. Yeah, that's what my response. So two things: affordances and safety reasons. That's what I can see. But obviously, it's not a definite answer, and not you should research more to understand these questions.
Thank you.
The second question about RC. So it broadcasts on different languages. So I wonder if you look at how marginal the content is for different languages. In specific, where you mentioned that the English version of RC does not emphasize Russia in the so what would you about the Russian version of RC?
It's very different for every broadcaster. So, for example, French RT, they broadcast their own kind of regional country-related content. So American RT does its own content, but the Russian version of RT is a peculiar one. because they actually, kind of recently there's been a lot of discussion about Russian RT, and they actually started to employ some of the kind of notorious speakers who used to be part of the democratic opposition, but now kind of changed the camp. They've been criticized heavily, but then they said, hey, I mean, RT does quite good stuff, and you can call it propaganda, but we can use its resources for the positive means. And so it's really hard for me to compare various contents, because I don't speak German or French that well. But as far as I know, like based on the account of my colleagues, kind of each broadcaster basically produces the content that is relevant to this particular country, which is again quite an interesting platform, quite an interesting approach to use.
So we looked at it in Europe a lot, and certainly this is in Germany, and I think it's this way in France as well. So there seems to be a dividing up of responsibilities. So RT does a lot of international stories, and big stories, Syria, Ukraine, while Sputnik does the really, really partisan stuff. So Sputnik, when we monitored the 2017 election in Germany, Sputnik was the one where, I can't remember which percent, but the only party that they were positive about was the AfD. I mean, it was just latent AfD supporting. While RT was actually very balanced. We did a big kind of content analysis over several months. They were pretty balanced. They didn't seem to want to get involved in national politics. For them, it's much more wanted to soak up as much of an audience as possible, and then do the story that the White Helmets are actually crisis actors, or Al-Qaeda, or that Ukraine is full of fascists. So they seem to have split up responsibilities. I mean, they're two agencies with a lot of people who sleep with each other, literally, between them. But they're different. They seem to have split up. And actually, they connect to different people in the presidential administration. So Gromov has RT, and Rossiyski was Ivanov, but I'm not sure who it is now. I don't know, but that's why Kishilov was made head of it, because he was...
I have a quick follow-up question for the RT, for the Russian group. Who were the sort of democratic, the sort of opposition figures that you mentioned that sort of crossed over?
That joined RT Russia?
Yeah, because I mean, I'm always sort of interested, like, you know, there's very little sort of kind of cross-pollination or discussion between sort of liberal and conservative. I sort of wonder, like, who would they be?
The good guys and the bad guys. So Maria Baronova and Ekaterina Vinokurova. So the two journalists in Russia that used to be very active during the protests in 2011. A few weeks ago, they joined RT, and they're running now some social projects, I think so. Charities, yeah. And they argue, well, we are going to be improving the life of ordinary Russians. So we're not participating in propaganda, in other words.
I think that there's that question about RT and who watches it. I mean, it's very important that, apart from this kind of like stuff that Ilya was talking about, to understand it as part of an ecology. So again, Kate Starbuck's research, and this is very good, Olivia Solon did a wonderful study, together with Kate, I think, about how the conspiracy theories about the White Helmet spread. So they're seeded in a lot of very, very strange publications, which might well go back to somebody in the Kremlin, a bit like the stuff we heard in Belarus. Very, very strange websites. Journalists they're not really journalists, they're kind of weird bloggers who are very pro-Assad. These people have no recognition anywhere. They're seeded in lots of publications at the same time, lots and lots of Twitter accounts at the same time. That may be a way of gaming the algorithms, getting them up on Google. But then RT step in and take these utterly fringe people with their crazy stories and put them on RT. Now, you think RT is fringe? Compared to that fringe, this was already a big international TV channel in every in every hotel room. So suddenly they've taken stuff that was over there, probably planted by the Russians, mainstreamed it, and from there it gets narrative laundered to a lot of publications across the world. So it's a narrative laundering system, which is actually quite efficient in its kind of like taking stuff which was absolutely loony. And then of course, even though RTTV, we can talk about how bad its ratings are, they're clearly not great. On YouTube they have a very, very powerful strategy. They've created more YouTube channels than anyone else. It's a way of gaming YouTube. Again, they're playing the algorithms very well. For a long time, if you put in the White Helmets, you all know who I talk about the White Helmets, yeah? There's Syrian activists. If you go to the White Helmets, it was virtually all RT content. So they're playing the algorithms very, very well. You have to see it as part of an ecology, and one that's also linked to, the actual sort of, near genocide of whole cities in Syria. So it is a whole system.
So the bottom feeders of that ecosystem would be like InfoWars laundered upward to RT and then spread
So the
out.
InfoWars RT and the InfoWars Russia relationship is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
I haven't studied, I've read some papers about it, but that's absolutely fascinating. And there's a clear moment when RT and Russian ads start appearing in InfoWars. I'm not the big expert on that.
There's a quick comment and then a question and a follow-up on that. So the quick comment is that story that you're telling about like the pathway from the fringes in is very common to what, it's a similar story to what we hear about in the US, right? Of things coming in, being discussed first on 4chan or 8chan, and then some of that stuff making a leap to getting to Breitbart, and then from Breitbart some of that stuff makes a leap to Fox, and then once it's on Fox you get the New York Times and CNN covering the fact, not the story, but the fact that it's on Fox, right, and stories about it. So that's like a familiar pattern. But the question I just wanted to ask was, so if the Russian government controls RT and the Russian government is planning the stories, that seems like an awful lot of extra work. Why couldn't the stories just go straight to RT? So is this another manifestation of Kremlin politics where there's different people in different politics who could have control over different sources? I mean, that seems, I don't understand, because I think in the US story that's told in this regard, it's alt-right folks on 4chan and 8chan who want Breitbart to pick them up. It's not the exact same actors, and there's symbiotic relationships there and everything like that. But you're saying that the Russians plant stories in these fringe things, and then they pick them up on RT. Couldn't they just put them on RT to start with and skip the planting stage?
So the planting stage, there's probably several factors involved there.
Yeah.
They could also be ways of sort of gaming the Google algorithm, getting like the same story out in lots and lots of places. So I think that could be that.
Okay.
Again, it could be, because we don't really know how it all connects together.
Is it like trial balloons?
Huh?
Is it like trial balloons?
I think it might be a way sometimes for, not necessarily, that could be a way for artists to pick up the story. Oh, we saw the story somewhere, that kind of like, they did that with a good example of that is, I think they did have a story about how the CIA invented Ebola as a weapon. So it appears somewhere, they go, oh look, we saw this somewhere, isn't this an interesting story? That could be a way to do it. But I think it could be several sort of digital media strategies, for getting stuff out there, and then laundering it through RT. So there could be different reasons, there could be competing bits, but it doesn't feel like that. So what do we, look, it's always a bit of a black box when we get to the center of it. But going back to the Nemtsov example, is that you who gave the example of the murder of Nemtsov? So we have some testimony from people who were inside the troll farms when the Nemtsov murder happened. I'm talking here about coordination. So the Nemtsov murder happens, it's all over the news, it's all over RT, and people rush into the troll farm in St. Petersburg and start saying, write these comments under these articles, under these things. Yeah? So clearly there's some coordination happening between the troll exercises and the mainstream media. But how tight it is, and who's doing that?
But in specific cases.
Yeah.
Normally,
White Helmet I think would be quite a specific campaign.
Yeah. But I think we need to distinguish like day-to-day practices and kind of specific, really big things like Nemtsov's murder. My interviews with the RT staff basically show that they are told explicitly, pick up a story that criticizes the West. Whatever it is, kind of post it, comment it, make a report on that. This is the main thing. Like, no matter how checked it is, just pick it up and spread the word. This is how it works. And all this laundering stuff, right? In the Truthseeker, which is, again, it's a very peculiar type of the program of RT, but it shows really well how the channel engages and used to engage with these specific narratives. So, for example, they're going to have one guy, an expert, who will be representing a certain blog, a certain website, right? Then a couple of programs later, this is the same guy but with a different affiliation. Then the same guy, like in the 5 programs in the third blog, or something like that. And like, they are constantly presenting in a different way. So once he's an expert on revolutions, then kind of next day he's doing something else. So it's a very interesting and kind of strange process that is going on. But there is just one big goal: undermine kind of this mainstream narrative from the West. Make sure that you plant as many doubts as possible.
just want to say in terms of planting stuff, sorry, this is very quick. I think with Infowars, they probably wouldn't have to plant it. They would, I mean, if they were smart, they would just sort of mine these sites like Alex Jones, because I mean, if you want stories about, you know, churches being, you know, whole cities being burned down, or Muslim, you know, or women being raped in European churches, you would just go to Alex Jones, pick the story up from there, launder it upward, and you would save yourself the work. That's sort of responsible.
Can I just speculate? I think that Alex Jones and RT anyway are competitors. So, Alex Jones used to appear on RT back in the days like 2011, 2012. He was a few times on various programs, but then he disappeared. Maybe when he became the big media in a way himself, they figured out that maybe they are sort of targeting the same audience. So maybe it's not good to promote him. But this is just my speculation. I don't have any factual.
Well, also it seems less fringe coming from RT, which is you can get on a cable channel. You have to tune in and seek out Alex Jones, but
through your fillings in your teeth.
no, I take the supplements, so that's stopped.
Well, thank you for the comment. There was a question right here, and then yes, those two questions. You know,
So, Jason, I had to run and teach, so I missed the actual talk, but I'm not.
I can repeat.
Kremlin does a lot of conspiracies.
I'm interested particularly in, so the Russian Orthodox Church has gotten into the business now of news broadcasting, and I follow certain figures there, and their involvement with strictly spiritual matters. So, you know, who Dmitry Smirnov is archpriest. He's, as I gather, on TV a lot. He was saying, if you don't go home and start making Russian babies right now, you better get used to licking Chinese foods, and a lot of those sorts of things. So, how much play is Spas getting, Telekanal Spas, and is anybody looking at their co-belligerency in this? From what I know, they're doing a lot of the same things, and their network is a little different. They get to make nice with Opus Dei outside. Now I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but
That's all right.
actually,
It's true.
and with American evangelicals making a common front in, for example, the World Congress of Families.
Yeah.
Is anybody tracking them? How do they figure in?
I'm sure there's research on that. I'm not doing that particular research, but I used to watch a few programs broadcast by Tsargrad, which is a similar source, and it is interesting that the guy who is very famous in Russian conspiracy culture, and now the global conspiracy culture, Alexander Dugin, used to be with Tsargrad, but now he's with Spas. So he changed the channel.
Spas,
Well, he had quite an interesting program on Tsargrad, Direktiva Dugina, with him sitting very seriously and talking about philosophical matters. But I mean, I think that this orthodox conspiratorial content, partially, it's quite marginal. I don't think that the channel Spas has incredible numbers. I think it's a very niche thing. Plus, it competes with so many, for example, I don't know, some speakers on the YouTube, plus Tsargrad, which basically share the same audience. As for conspiracy theories, some of them are quite, well, traditionally Russian anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Not sure they talk about that on Spas, because that would be something beyond the regular, right? As for this content about families, this is the content that can be easily sold to international audiences, especially when it's wrapped in a specific way. So if we say, well, what about conservatives in the US? What about conservatives in Germany? What about conservatives in France? what about anti-LGBT attitudes? And so both the Russian Orthodox kind of conservatives in Germany, France, and the US will be sharing more or less the same kind of notion, right? So, for example, if we refer to the Pussy Riot case in 2012, the narrative was that, well, these guys who are supported by the liberals in the United States, they are ruining these spiritual bonds around the world. So, Pussy Riot is supported by some freaks in Norway, in Germany, in the United States, so we'd better stay away from them, right? So it is a very interesting process to see how these guys from Russia are basically kind of joining this international kind of Comintern, you know, of conservatives. That's interesting to observe, that's interesting to study. I haven't done this research, but we can discuss that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for very interesting material, and a lot of it was new to me. I have a question about Telegram, and then like to maybe back up into Peter's final comments on regulatory solutions. With respect to Telegram, the only reason I had heard of Telegram is because I understand reporters use it because it's a little more hack-proof than Messenger and other messaging systems. I was unfamiliar with the channel capability in it, but all that said, WhatsApp is way more popular around the world, and it has been in the crosshairs of a lot of regulation because of its seeming ability, to incite riots and incite a lot of genocide in countries like India and Brazil, where it's very, very heavily used. And there aren't a lot of alternatives that are available to the large populations in those countries. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on, and I was totally unfamiliar with the fact that given this issue of channels, that it could be co-opted, because in fact countries like Iran, from what I've read, and Russia don't like Telegram, and they worked against it and tried to undo it. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on the state relationships with Telegram versus WhatsApp, and then more broadly, the second issue then is there any regulation that can begin to cope with some of the either unanticipated or untoward outcomes of these systems?
All right, thank you. Well, perhaps a regulation question I should leave to Peter, is someone who promotes some regulatory solutions. As to the WhatsApp versus Telegram, indeed, I think it's actually also a case of Russia as well. WhatsApp is the most popular messenger in general, in terms of number of users, but Telegram is something that is popular among people who are interested in politics. The reason it was popular in Iran was very simple, because all other platforms were simply blocked. You could not access them. So Telegram remained the only solution for those guys. Another interesting community that used Telegram quite actively, and it was popular among those people, was ISIS. So ISIS quite extensively used it, and especially they enjoyed this depository function as well. So you see that it's a thing for specific types of communities apparently, and you see it also can be used for promotion of pro-democracy ideas as well, as Navalny did, I believe, as Navalny community did. It also can be used for something like disruption and misinformation, that was Kremlin did in Belarus. So I wouldn't say that platforms have only one specific direction of the use. They could be used for both, depending on the actors, who are using them. For that perhaps we need some regulation, but when it comes to non-democratic countries, it's more complicated. Russian state tries to filter Telegram, right? It tries to block it. And was it successful? Not much. Not much. And if you heard of very recent legislation in Russia about internet sovereignty, right? That been adopted. I think was it Putin who signed it or not yet? He's gonna sign it in a few days. So it actually turns, many people say, it turns Russian internet into some version of Chinese internet. So it would be much easier to control and block things like Telegram. And many people say that Telegram is one of the reasons why those legislation have been introduced. So far, government in Russia has no power to block it. In the future, they might have it. And then we'll see what happens. But it seems like, in my understanding, that platforms, again, they can be used for both methods. It depends really on actors. It's very often something we cannot really affect, unfortunately. Yeah, and I leave regulation to you.
So you mean the regulation of specifically private messaging?
Well, I left it very, very big, and you and I were speaking over lunch about some of the nuances of regulatory opportunities, but these platform companies are really way outside what conventional communication regulation has addressed. They're versatile, they're international, they operate in varied ways. So, you know, what do you foresee as the most viable ways to address what your final remarks talked about, focusing on illegitimate influences and defining legitimate versus illegitimate? That sounds like a rabbit hole to me.
So that's going to be very tough even for open platforms, but when it comes to private messaging groups, it becomes extra tough. So when sort of a lot of the consultants around the British government who were working on this, they first said the regulatory ideas aren't even going to touch private messaging groups. Then, as you say, there was a lot of evidence that private messaging groups is where some of the nastiest action is, and now they've completely fudged it in the latest white paper. They're like, well, we'll talk about it, because it's so difficult. If we're talking of that kind of soft self-regulation that platforms have been encouraged to do, so working with fact checkers, for example, so there's been some, I think, very superficial attempts by Facebook to do that. But when it comes to WhatsApp groups, I think Facebook's thing is we don't know what's going on there. So that came, I think that was a big issue in the Brazilian.
To limit the size of the groups.
Yeah, well, for example. But at what point does a private messaging service stop being a service and start becoming something else? There's lots of things one can think about, but their excuse, I think, in Brazil was, well, we can't, where a lot of the sort of Bolsonaro campaigning was in WhatsApp groups as well, we don't know what's going on there, so we can't work with fact checkers to do anything about it. But you're right, that could be a way forward to change those definitions. I mean, in India, where WhatsApp groups are used to kind of literally incite ethnic violence, you now have special cops who go undercover onto WhatsApp groups, and when they see what the Indians consider illegal hate speech or incitement to violence, they arrest people. So people have gone to jail now for, you know, I mean, not new regulation, old regulation, but you have these kind of WhatsApp spies, which again is kind of creepy.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you know, those are the kind of responses that have been.
There is another option, and this comes from China, and it's not necessarily the best option, but if you're familiar with WeChat, which is another popular messenger, most popular in China, and if you remember, it's a very private just case from my friend. Panama Papers. Do you remember that scandal, yeah, about offshore stories? And it revealed that some Chinese officials also had kind of accounts abroad. And but this story never been shared in China because of censorship. But people exchange private messages on WeChat, and they use WeChat. So one of my friends sent an article that featured the story in Chinese with a Chinese friend using WeChat. So it was just a chat of two people. Yeah, it was censored immediately by algorithms. 2 years ago, Chinese WeChat already had this capability. This story never reached the recipient. It's another way, yeah? Algorithmic it's kind of filtering, but I'm not sure that Western countries would take this part.
Yes, sir.
So I want to go in that vein. I want to go back to this idea of creating a channel and then looking at the ecology that channel creates and then creating a narrative to work that ecology, fighting a narrative or propagating that mentioned harm. So my question is, what efforts are being made or will be made to create a way, an analysis of harm assessment? In other words, some kind of a way of considering risk, testing whether or not that paradigm works, to identify risk and harm, so that you have some way of actually implementing this harm reduction, whether you can intervene or not.
So you just hit the great question that's surrounding the British regulation that's just been proposed. I mean, it's going to be a 2-year process at least. So what they've done is taken the idea of offline harms, health and safety regulation, and try to move it online. And a lot of the critics have immediately said, that's ridiculous. You can't do that. You can't make, offline harm involves, damage to a person from someone else. That's almost impossible to legislate for when it comes to speech. So we're in a new space. And what I think will happen over the next few years is an attempt to build consensus around this problem. So the government are fudging it. The government are saying, the new regulator which we will create will decide upon this. They don't want to take intellectual responsibility for it. One of the interesting papers is done by Full Fact, which is Britain's probably best fact-checking organisation, and they try to do kind of a scale of harm. And the least harmful is just bullshit. So the stuff, the Macedonian sites, all that is, we don't even think about that, that's all nonsense. Then I think the next they had, like, politicians undermining trust. So politicians lying. So Donald Trump's tweets might start crawling into the harms thing. We're not going to take them down, but that starts entering it. Then I think they have electoral interference and political advertising, with the huge question of what is political advertising, because it has to go way beyond elections. And then they have stuff which I think is what the government really cares about, which is kind of bullying online, aggressive targeting of individuals, state-sponsored trolling, and then right at the bottom is going to be stuff to do with public health. So the vax thing is the one that everyone talks about. So that could be a way of at least starting to conceptualize it. But we are in a completely new space. We are dealing with things which are harmful but legal. It's an incredibly fraught space. However, I do think it's at least a way we can start. I think a lot of this will be sort of social consensus. We're going to have to create a framework that we can start having some sort of agreement about this. Lawyers obviously hate this. They loathe all this. Like, it's inaccurate, it's vague, this is awful, legally this is terrible. It's a hell of a lot better than trying to look pieces of liability for every piece of content. The way I think the harms discussion will go, and I hope it goes, is actually about algorithmic accountability and actually thinking about this on the level of the argument. So if YouTube really is promoting extremist rabbit holes, how do we start thinking about that? Because maybe at that level it would be easier to reach some sort of agreement. I think it's a much more constructive conversation than one can have as opposed to the German one, which is regulating every piece of content. But it's going to be very, very complex and very, very new. I don't think one can simply take ideas from broadcasting, because in Britain we do have regulation around broadcasting, and move it to the online space. Yeah? There we do have ideas about harm and offence and stuff like that, and undermining our democratic values. Wonderfully amorphous language about broadcasting. I don't think you can just move that to the online space, where we have completely different expectations around. Was that Duke? Was that Spus TV?
So that's a Russian intervention.
Yeah, well, this actually is the other problem. I mean, I think Tim Wu has still written the greatest essay about this. I mean, we still think about freedom of speech in a very early 20th century way. And we haven't learned how to deal with the problem of censorship via overload of information abundance, and what we do about that, which I think is another big factor to think about. Look, it's going to be a complicated process. It could go terribly wrong. We could create regulators, and then Orbans come to power throughout Europe, and then we end up living in kind of if not quite in Russia's, at least in Hungary's. So there's many, many dangers ahead. But I think simply saying, oh, we don't need regulation in this weird new space, I don't think that's a response either. So I know you disagree. You're more libertarian on this.
Well, thank you.
I didn't mean that in a bad way.
Well, obviously regulation gonna come in. The question is how it's gonna look. Whether it's gonna look more Chinese way, or more remote, let's say more in tradition of democracy that many countries has.
I don't think it can go the Chinese way. So in Germany they've introduced this law. I had a lovely few drinks with a judge from the European Court of Human Rights, and they're just waiting for the first case to come against the German government. And they think the German government will lose it. So even if the government wanted to go that way, I mean, unless Britain, for example, leaves the European Court of Human Rights and its freedom of speech laws, then I don't think you can do that, even if you wanted to. So I'm less worried than some of the free speech fundamentalists that we're on our path to authoritarianism. I think there are very strong kind of checks against that. I think it could just be useless, and ridiculous, and you'll just get up thousands of court cases around like posts. I mean, it's absurd. It's an absurd way to go down, rather than a dangerous one. But I don't know. I mean, I'm just fascinated with what happens here. Because I think in Europe there's a tradition of regulation, and it'll happen. In Britain there's a tradition of regulation, it'll happen. There's strong democratic traditions. I'm much more interested in America, where the crisis seems to be much more visceral.
Do you think maybe it'll start, as you said, as an individualism issue of bullying, where we have kids in high school committing suicide because they've been bullied, and something like that, and that will move forward into a larger way of figuring out about how aggressive harm, identifying it. Maybe the recipient has a way to say, I don't like this, I'm being bullied, and that immediately creates a shutdown.
I mean, for example, so what, if I understand, so again, I keep on coming back to the British White Paper, it only came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's weirdly written, and I think it's amorphous on purpose. But when I kind of try to interrogate some of the people who wrote it, they were like, they're very keen to make it clear they don't want to police content, they just want to make sure there are systems in place. If this is happening on Facebook, exactly, have Facebook got a system in place that could mitigate this harm? So if somebody's being bullied, by the way, proving self-harm from bullying, again, incredibly fraught, but is there a system in place that can react quickly, and exactly, is there a possibility for takedowns? Are the companies doing enough to mitigate these situations? Do they have mechanisms in place? Which, I mean, that seems to be the way they want to go. I think that was a good example, but I have to say, the white paper is very clear. They're not just talking about individual harms. They do use this very, very woolly language about social harms,
So
which is really hard to
from
define.
an individual level to a larger social harm.
This is a conversation that's going to take 3 years, literally. I just don't have the final answer.
I'm glad that we do have that, but just in case we do have any other questions from, yes, Professor Berger?
It's a little bit of a bigger picture question. I guess just throughout the day, we've seen ways in which social media has an impact on political decisions, but in many ways, a lot of the arguments have said it doesn't, like that people's minds are already made up, or that there are other things that have equal, sort of impact as social media in terms of mobilizing people. But it seems to me, or that, social media can be used both by opposition forces and by authoritarian ones, so maybe it cancels out, in a sense. But it still seems to me like what keeps running through my mind is that there is something fundamentally different about the social, living in a world in which information is circulating over social media from when, say, I was in college and we barely had email, right? And where there was a general trust of the mainstream media, and where there was conspiracy theory, but it was very fringe, I think. It seems to me it's less fringe now because we have the President of the United States tweeting it. And so what I'm wondering is, is there something fundamental, is true, I feel like with the bombardment of information, of the lack of regulation of information over all these various channels, that truth is more imperiled than ever. It's much harder to kind of know what's true and what's not. And that because of that, it's a much more dangerous field for democracy and sort of stable politics. So there you go. So again, this may take 3 days too, but I'm trying to, kind of get a handle on, how the world is completely, is the world completely different or not in this sort of social media information environment.
Thank you.
Silence, there's silence.
Peter?
I've spent the last 2 years at so many round tables having this conversation. Does it change anything? Has anything changed? Is it all the same? And it's exhausting in the sense that, from a kind of like media effects point of view, there are so many debates and so little testing of anything so far. But what we can say, I think, when I've been in these discussions, what I think people agreed on was that we're dealing with a much more fractured environment. And that's not just social media. That started with cable channels, and then social media took it to another level. And that, again, this is a line that was in the Full Fact paper, and Full Fact is a fact-checking organization. They're skeptics about that social media has impact. But they kind of did agree that that fracturing means that it's harder to make democracy a shared experience. I think that's happened. I mean, that started happening with, in America with the cable channels. So I think that's definitely happening. And I think that then produces a certain political strategy, which we call populism, and that we may be misinterpreting. So if you're a spin doctor or a political campaigner, and you have to hit, not like, you don't have to go on CBS or BBC and win a debate. You've got like 30 different Telegram channels and cable news and different fractured audiences that you have to reach. This is the way the Brexit campaign works, actually. You start doing completely different messages to all those different groups. And the only way you can connect them, this is not centrism. You don't want to connect them through one ideology. That would be killer. So Brexit was actually the most popular ads they did was to people who really care about animal rights, saying the EU is bad for animal rights. Those were the most effective online ads to get people to vote, according to the guy who created them. So you can never believe a PR guy, but you know what I mean. But certainly nothing about like immigration or all these other issues. So you can create a completely different messages, and then you need something very, very amorphous, like the idea of the people to connect them with, and then you need a non-people in order to oppose them to. And then we have a kind of all these pathologies of what we're calling populism these days, and yeah. So I think the media, the fractured nature of the media, has sort of undermined this idea of a shared space for democracy, and is then promoting a certain type of politics. These politicians then are absolutely useless at governing, because they've sold so many different stories in so many different ways. So I think that is definitely happening. So the change in the media has changed political strategies and changed the way we mediate democracy. Whether it has more effect, whether people believed in stuff already, whether their minds would change. This is like, media effects, I think, from what I understand, has been trying to work out the question of whether violent films make you violent for like 50 years. And they've decided that sometimes maybe. Media effects is such a torturous field. So if at least we could agree on those two things, that's already enough for me to sort of build a think tank around.
Thank you for that, Ilya. Would you just address that as well?
I think that, well, when you talk about conspiracy theories and whether social media helps spread them more aggressively, in a way, because it's much easier, and I think that there's been some research on how various links are being spread on Facebook and how deep these links actually go into communities and into further shares. It's definitely easier, and very few kind of people really carefully read what's being posted, or sometimes clickbait stuff and kind of articles or ideas that resonate with certain individuals. They are being shared much more kind of actively within certain communities. So, for example, kind of these echo chambers that's being discussed quite often after Brexit, etc. I've been at the talk in Leeds by Paolo Mancini. So he did a research on echo chambers during Italian elections, and that showed that actually there are no echo chambers. So people kind of unite on specific during specific cases. So if this issue is very important for a particular individual, for a particular group, they're going to unite, they're going to shape this echo chamber, and then they're going to kind of disappear and join other groups when it comes to different issues, right? So one individual can support one idea at the same time support a different idea. Maybe that's why this kind of difference in targeting, kind of spreading different message to different audience, maybe that's why it works nowadays, right? But then, again, is it helpful to spread conspiracy theories online through social media? Yes, and at the same time, no. There are people who kind of who consume conspiracy theories in traditional ways. They watch films, right? they read books.
Generic sort of.
Yeah, it's kind of it's a traditional way. So I don't think that there's been much difference in. There's certainly a lot of hype around that. There's a lot of hype around fake news and how fake news helps spreading conspiracy theories. But come on, fake news existed all the time, right? It's like in Russian, that's what we call it, "Одна бабка сказала," right? This is the agency. Like, this is fake news in the good old days.
Fake news. And Alex, would you add your comments if you have any? Just
All right, perhaps I just want to remind everyone that essentially social media do not produce any effect at all until they've been used by someone. So we need to use social media to have some effect, or not, right? So in that way, social media is just a reflection of reality. They reflect who we are. We got bullied before social media. Now, okay, maybe they amplify because some people use them to bully someone, and it amplifies things. But it doesn't mean that if social media suddenly disappears, all conspiracy theory, all bullying, everything disappears next morning. No. Maybe earlier days there were more good guys who learned how to use social media. These days, also bad guys learn how to use them. Maybe in the future, everyone would learn how to use them probably, and it will make things, quite neutral and not many. I wouldn't say that we should be that much concerned with huge changes. I think it's about our society rather than about new technologies.
Very quickly, just to bring you back to Russia, because this is a Russia event, sort of, isn't it?
Yeah.
So look, a lot of the stuff that we see in the West now, these politicians who don't seem to care about what they tell the truth, this kind of endless cynicism about everything, and mistrust that's used as a strategy. To anybody, and also this idea of this kind of pop-up populism that I just described. So to anyone who knows Russia well, this feels like deja vu. This was already in Russia in the 90s and early 2000s. And often I sit with my Russian friends, especially those who left Russia to get away from it, and they're like, oh my God, it's come here. And I don't think it's come here because Putin has put it here.
Yeah.
And Russia was doing this without social media. This was still an old media. But I do think Russia has a critical role in all of that, but that's in my book.
That's a very good lead.
Thank you, gentlemen. One last question before we close this session. Sir?
It's honestly just a comment actually about the discussion of social media. I agree with you that social media is a reflection of things going on in the public, but I would push back on the idea that it's not something we should take seriously in terms of the movement of ideas. There's a substantial amount of research in my field showing that, to put it in one sentence, that it's allowed the worst people to find the other worst people and work together to push some very dangerous ideas. And also, on top of the fact that we have seen examples of their simple, sophisticated use of bots to create things, make things trend on Twitter, which we know journalists in America, at least in the American context, they do look there to see what are the people. Well, we're talking about Star Wars is what that was a bot-produced trending topic. So, my comment on that.
Absolutely, we should take them seriously, very seriously. I agree, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, let's give them a hand.
Yeah, just a quick 15-minute break.
Good to see you. Take it on. All right. I just trying to figure out where.
Absolutely similar.
Oh, where we're at.
Absolutely. And I was like, no, it's happened. Yes, of course. Well, that
some sort of discourse. You probably so that's a good point.
Very good. Very well.
It's a paperweight.
It's like you know what to do. Because you've been talking about this for quite some time. I mean, the presentation.
Yes, in fact, if you want to hear
All right. Yeah, so this for the previous even better.
Should we?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So you can two documents or more for my chapter.
Yeah. I forgot it in the photo. Yeah, let's do that.
I guess dump it in.
Yeah. You can bring up dump this up, but you can leave it right here.
It's removable. But would that cover the table?
How was your class? I think it went well, as far as I can judge.
Sorry I missed it. It's really just awful timing.
Easy
leaving tomorrow morning. Yeah.